Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. If you followed our podcast for long, you've probably heard about the Next Economy MBA. What you might not know is that we wrote a book about it, and it's coming out on May 23rd. The Next Economy MBA book combines our experience working with Next Economy organizations and over 400 alumni that have taken our course. It's designed for impact leaders who seek to develop a business strategy from a socially just and environmentally regenerative perspective. This book is a great way to dive deeper into the principles and case stories we discuss on the podcast, and includes a workbook to put learnings from the program into practice. You can pre-order a copy for yourself or a friend at lifteconomy.com/MBA book. Thanks for listening, and now on to the show.
Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
I'm Jeanette Moreland, part of the team at Lift Economy. My guest today is Esha Chhabra, a writer and journalist focused on global development, environment, and business. Esha has traveled around the world meeting entrepreneurs, farmers, artisans, and activists firsthand, going beyond the greenwashing to determine if companies are actually pushing the needle. Her work has been supported by the UN Foundation and the Pulitzer Center, and has appeared in the New York Times, Fast Company, The Washington Post, Wired, and more. Esha is also the author of the new book, Working to Restore: Harnessing the Power of Regenerative Business to Heal the World, which explores how entrepreneurs are using their businesses as catalysts of change to solve social and environmental problems. Welcome to the show, Esha.
Thank you, Jeanette. So nice to be here.
Amazing. So I would love to start with just having you tell us a little bit about your background. How did you first get interested in the work that you're doing today?
It's been a long journey. I've been writing about sustainability and mission-driven companies for over 10 years now. When I came into this space, it was still being called corporate social responsibility. And it's a very different landscape where people were thinking about this as like a tangential thing that a business did and not at the core of what a company does. So it's been an evolution, I think, also in the way that we tell the stories about this industry. But I started freelance writing when I came out of college and then out of grad school. And I was actually writing about health programs, global health programs in developing countries. And I was a bit frustrated by media. I felt like there were stories out there that we should be highlighting that weren't getting the attention. So I decided to do that through a freelance career and just pitching, editors at The Guardian, at The Atlantic, and I was very grateful that many of them expressed interest. And that kind of motivated me to how do I write about these sort of, perhaps you could say, less reported stories or ignored stories. And then I came across the work of David Bornstein and Tina Rosenberg, who started something called Solutions Journalism Network. And David had become an early mentor of mine. And he was trying to pilot something at the New York Times, just called the Fixes column in those days. And this idea of how do we as writers and reporters talk about solutions in a critical, but also optimistic way, right? So we all knew at that point that there were social challenges and the environmental challenges were only growing. But there were already, these social entrepreneurs, as you know, working on these problems. So how did we share their stories? And that really framed my career and has continued to be, the focus of my writing. I'm very interested in companies that are now tackling sustainability and kind of getting beyond the greenwashing. That's something that I really look at in the book is, to get to the core of supply chains, to get the core of social impact programs. And also, newer words now like regenerative, which is in the subtitle of the book. So that's me in a nutshell. But yeah, I based in Southern California, but was born in India, which also I think gave me an interesting lens because I'm the first generation immigrant to the United States. So you just always know kind of how to walk in two cultures and two different perspectives, which is very helpful as a journalist. You're very, I think, open and empathetic then to other people's stories and perspectives. And then went to DC for undergrad, which was during the Bush administration and spent my first years as, a young aspiring journalist running down and trying to get news bites from politicians in DC in those days, which was also, very eye-opening to see the back end of it. And then went to the London School of Economics, spent time in the UK and did my master's there. And that's really when I started to build this career of freelance writing.
Amazing. I would love to just touch back on your career in journalism. But first, I would love to talk about your new book. Just came out in March. Congratulations. So,
thank you.
Working to Restore. I'm really curious what inspired you to write a book, as we chatted about before, a big undertaking, and would love to know a little bit about who's it for.
It is a big undertaking. It's taken several years to put together. Working to Restore, I felt like was filling a gap. I had read a lot of books that were on social entrepreneurship. They were beautiful books. They were wonderful books, but they were written for people who were really interested in that space and perhaps already working in that space. I wanted to write something more from a journalistic lens and less, of an academic lens. And so I had the opportunity to go and meet with these entrepreneurs and see their work in really incredible locations around the world. I mean, we're looking at the Amazon, we're looking at the plains, east of the Serengeti to the Himalayas. And I was like, how do we bring these stories to the general public, which also at this time around 2018 was really taking interest in how do you support companies that are doing something better, right? Like that movement had really swelled up by then. So that was the idea behind the book, was like, let's put out there a book that's just a series of case studies or vignettes. So there's about 30 companies that are featured in the book. They're across industries. And that also shows that, look, this is not something that's just happening in food or just happening in fashion. It's really happening across the board. And so if you want to think about how you're going to reposition or refashion your life to be more eco-friendly or be more conscious, you can really do it in a lot of facets of your life. So that was one thing, to give a really journalistic overview. And then in terms of bringing it together, it took 2 years of reporting. So I spent a lot of time before the pandemic really in the field meeting these companies, the ones that I hadn't seen their work firsthand. And that was an important part of it too. Like I wanted to have experience meeting the entrepreneurs in person, engaging with them, because I think I come from that slightly more old school, world of journalism where you really get out there and go and you see it. So that's another aspect of this book. It has that slightly travel aspect to it as well.
Yeah, I loved that. It's definitely something that came through for me. I felt like I was there and placing myself in those contexts and situations. I think one of my favorite things when I was reading the book was actually this idea of shifting perception, as you mentioned. Things have really changed in the last few years, but there is this idea that when we shift our perception, the way that we look at things, it can actually influence our reality. So you write about looking at trash as this opportunity to repurpose into all these different objects. I remember reading the chapter about plastic whale and looking at plastic in the Amsterdam canals as a boardroom table, for example, and just the imagination there. Or looking at the role of women, and not just in this domestic sense, but actually as key leaders in international supply chains. So I guess I would love if you could chat a little bit more about what you're hoping that readers who, again, might not have that really deep social entrepreneurship background are going to view or see differently after having spent some time with these stories.
I think you picked up on a really nice theme in the book. I mean, these are all opportunities to build a business. So when you see trash, whether it's food waste or plastic waste, that's an opportunity to really create something new, to build a whole new supply chain, to build a whole new business model. And that's such a much more optimistic way at looking at the problem than just saying, you know what, yeah, we have a ton of waste and what are we going to do with it? It's destroying, the planet. And that's what really inspired me also. I mean, as an individual, yes, I'm a journalist and yes, I'm a writer, but I'm also just a consumer and I'm also trying to figure out, how I want to live my life. But to me, that was very inspiring storytelling. And it was kind of changing the perspective and changing the mindset. So yeah, you might see a piece of derelict land, but can you turn that derelict land into something that's full of produce or doing something positive for the local wildlife? There's so many opportunities of, if we just look at these problems with a different lens, we can actually see a solution and we can actually see the opportunity to create a business around it. And that's also something with these companies. So when I was going through and thinking about all the companies that are going to be in the book, I didn't include corporations, and there was a specific reason for that, because I think one it had been done. And two, I don't know if they come from a place of trying to solve a problem. Most of these companies that are in the book come from a place of what is the problem that we're trying to solve? It's that why that's super important. And as a journalist, you're always trained who, what, where, when, why, so the why is the big question. Why are you doing this? So that's even if it's a fashion company, like if you look at the example of Veja, they're a shoe company, right? But they got into the business of fashion not because they were really big on fashion, but because they wanted to create a supply chain in Brazil that had a very low footprint and therefore showed an alternative to the fashion industry that, yes, you can make sneakers this way. So I thought that was the most intriguing thing. And that's what I write in the forward, is that these are people that are really going after solving a core problem. There's Beyond Surface Technologies, which is kind of a very technical company, but it's so fascinating. The people who started it, they were industry leaders and working with companies in the kind of chemical finishes that are used on our clothing to make it, repel water, make the material softer. And after 20 years of having careers in the conventional side, they were like, wait a minute, this isn't resonating with me anymore. So how do we solve this massive problem and think about it as a bio-based solution? That was their why. It's like, yes, and now they're working with Patagonia and Adidas and North Face, and all the big brands. So definitely, I think the key here is to look at what is the problem you're looking to solve.
Yeah, it takes a lot of optimism and a lot of courage, right? To not just do things as usual and reimagine that. And I definitely got that reading those stories. I think something else that was also really surprising for me and something that we talk about a lot at Lyft is how many folks that you interviewed that were so willing to open source their solutions. So I'm thinking about like the Aravent healthcare system, harvest to harvest, transforming organic waste into fertilizer and wanting to just share that. Like there's a real strong sense of humility and like, hey, I have solved this problem, but I'm not going to take this and capitalize it and be the only one who owns this. They're like, we actually need more people in more communities doing the same type of work. And that feels really rare to me. I'm wondering if you, have any reflections on that or anything that maybe folks that you were interviewing shared of like, how do we move from this holding intellectual capital so tightly to actually like open sourcing and sharing this information so that we can all be part of the solution?
It's such a good point. And I think this comes from having a leader or a leadership group that is really mission driven. I mean, that's one thing that I noticed is that these companies are led by people who are not thinking about profit as number one. Yes, they recognize that they're running businesses, and so they have to make it financially strong, but that's not what's driving them. There's not like a certain, element of greed in that way, so to say, but they're really driven by like, we got to fix the fashion problem, or we got to fix the food organic, movement problem. Why are there not enough farmers doing organic farming? Well, because the fertilizer perhaps is more expensive, or it doesn't work with the existing drip lines that we have. So they're really looking at it like they're change makers. I mean, I think some of these people, frankly, would be in the nonprofit space rather than being in the traditional business space, but they recognize that the nonprofit space has its challenges. So they've created somewhat of a middle of the road, what we call social entrepreneurship kind of hybrid model. Absolutely. I mean, this idea of having to open up your R&D, I actually see it happening much more, especially in apparel. I see a lot of these sustainable fashion brands are actually very interested in collaborating with others and sharing their resources. At least as I do my reporting, I notice this kind of general desire to push the industry forward. I think that's the message that I hear the most is people are like, no, it's not just us doing it because we recognize maybe we only produce 10,000 units or 100,000 units. How do we get more people on board? In fact, Sebastian, the co-founder of Asia, he said very eloquently in the book when I talked to him that, we don't need one multinational company in the world that is really making the most ethical fashion. We need hundreds of mid-sized companies like ourselves. That replication has to happen, right? And that's probably also a much more sustainable solution in the long run, because then you're supporting so many economies, it's much more realistic to manage a business of that size. There's less financial pressure. So I agree. And that's what I wanted to highlight. Even Toast Ale, which is out of the UK, has tried to share their knowledge as to how they're turning sandwich bread into ale and get other people on board. So yeah, there has to be this collaboration, which I feel like has existed within the B Corp movement naturally as well. But it's perhaps getting enhanced more and more, especially in certain industries where people are realizing, in fashion, especially, they realize we can't do it ourselves. We have to get, 50 companies on board. So yeah, that's a very keen observation.
Exactly. And we're in a season where we can't afford not to collaborate. The things that we're addressing are so huge that, particularly with industries where you're doing a similar thing, just sharing those learnings feels so important. So it was really great to see that modeled. And it's really great to hear that you're seeing that just outside of the things that you reported on as well. I want to shift a little bit to just kind of your role as a storyteller, obviously very gifted storyteller, not just in the book, but in your other work. But something that we discuss a lot at Lyft is this idea of a poverty of imagination. So sometimes the hardest thing about moving towards the future that we want is that it's hard to imagine or envision what it looks like, especially when the dominant narrative or structure or system just feels so entrenched and overwhelming. So what role do you think that storytellers like yourself play in helping to shift our imagination towards the futures that we want to believe are possible? We might just struggle with how.
This is such a big question that I could talk about for an hour, actually, because it's the definition of basically the last 10 years. A couple things come to mind. I have a writing style that I've stuck to, perhaps because I'm not good at flowery language or very complicated language, but I keep it very simple and very straightforward. I think people are yearning for that kind of storytelling that's very human at its core, because what do we connect with? Human connection, human stories. Get away from the wonky language and the industry jargon and all of that and keep it super simple and just tell the story of whether it's a farmer, whether it's an entrepreneur, whether it's a doctor, whomever it is. I think that one connects people really well. And two, the conversation I've been having a lot lately, whether it's post release of the book or even just, preceding it, is that people are really hungry for these kind of stories. They don't want to read the news because the news is depressing. I can't tell you how many people I know who are key influential leaders who had really high ranking jobs. And when I talk to them, they're like, I don't really read the news anymore because I find it slightly depressing. I'm like, I hear you. So there is this hunger out there for storytelling that's intelligent, that's insightful, that's speaking to current events, but is far more pragmatic, is far more willing to be okay, this isn't working, but this could work, or this is something interesting that somebody's doing, or let's look at this. So I wouldn't get too bogged down, if you feel frustrated as a storyteller. I think the key is with anything else, you just have to keep doing it. There is a lot of noise out there today. And that's the other challenge is how do you break through all of that noise? But there are platforms that have exceeded. I mean, I look at something like Reasons to Be Cheerful, that particular Instagram handle and that platform. I mean, they've really been successful in just telling small, quick stories, right? These are things that are happening around the world. And maybe some of them won't happen in the end, just like some of these companies in the book might not succeed all the way in the end. But people are really gravitating to that. They're like, yeah, that's cool. We're seeing progress happening. And I think the other challenge that as storytellers we have is that the landscape is changing, right? So when I started doing media, it was a very simple journalistic approach. And the prime source for media platforms was still ad revenue. Today, it's so many different, sources. So there's affiliate marketing, there's all this stuff. So the model has changed. I remember having conversations with editors when they first started to talk about sponsored content, and everybody was kind of not so sure, should we be doing this? Should we be not doing this? Are we breaking the golden rule of journalism? But now it's such an embedded part of our culture. So part of it is also learning to shift with the times and just kind of learning to adapt with it all. I don't know if that's helpful. I mean, as an answer, I don't have the ideal answer, but I am always encouraging other people in this space, please keep doing what you're doing because we need people like that to focus on it because it can get really overwhelming. I mean, you can read the IPCC report that came out and just feel like none of our efforts are really helping. What are we doing? No, it's not the case. It is helping. It is making a small dent. And I think That goes back to that old philosophy of just like you do what works in your little community, right? And then that has a ripple effect around the world. And as storytellers, it's the same thing. Like keep doing what you're doing, and it does have a ripple effect.
I would happily listen to you for an hour or more talk about this because I just think that it's so important. And yeah, as someone who's in that space myself, I think the responsibility that we hold and the privilege of being that truth teller and like speaking that future into existence is really powerful. I want to maybe talk about the flip side before we wrap up. When thinking about just consumers, so you obviously wrote this book to be a more approachable primer to just kind of this future, this regenerative economy. And you do a lot of work in just like truth telling and moving past greenwashing. And I think folks can just have a hard time even knowing where to start. So for your average consumer or person who's picking up this book, is there a next step or a next action that you're maybe hoping for them to take when they've finished it and engaged with these stories?
I mean, I would hope that they would find some of these companies like things that they want to support. I mean, they would read it and they'd be like, oh, this is really cool. Maybe next time I decide I want to buy a pair of shoes or buy a sweater or buy a bottle of soap or whatever, I mean, they turn to these examples. I think for general consumers, I mean, one good place to start is B Corps. It's not a perfect solution, but it is one platform that you can go to and say, these companies have thought about a lot of different parts of their business. I mean, that's one thing I do like about B Corp is that it's not a certification that's just on how you grow something or just on how you treat your workers. It's really holistic in that way. It gets into like where you have your bank account. It gets into how you manage your workplace. It's everything. So I think that's one place to start. I think it's also to kind of prioritize in your life what you really want to tackle. You can't do everything. I mean, I think it's very hard and it's very overwhelming to try to do everything. If you talk to even like the most eco-forward people and eco-activists, I mean, they'll admit that they're not perfect and they're not saving every piece of plastic and all of that. So it's really sort of, if you're passionate about your food, maybe focus on your food. If you're really passionate about your travel, think about how your travel can have a positive impact. So maybe take one of these chapters or one of these key themes and see where you really feel like, A, you can apply your energy and your passion, but two, also then your money into that. And also the thing that I say to consumers is like, ask questions. The companies that are truly doing this work, that are really proud of how they manufacture a product or how they treat their workforce, are often going to be more than happy to answer those questions and explain it to you in detail. It's the companies that probably aren't doing it are the ones that are going to be like a little bit more coy in their response, right? So you will find out very quickly. So if you have questions, please ask. And I think scrutiny is so helpful. I mean, people sort of become very worried about media scrutiny and, the scrutiny from general public through social media. But if it's done in a thoughtful kind of fashion and not just completely, attacking someone, it can really help people make better choices. And it can tell companies like, look, our customers really want us to reduce our plastic waste. Like there's a grocery store in the States, right, that had so much feedback about its plastic waste that's used, in wrapping all the produce that they finally paid attention to the petition that went up on the internet, and then now they're trying to work towards reducing it. So I think that kind of stuff really does help drive us in the right direction. Don't fall for words. I think the words these days are really problematic. I mean, everybody's using the word sustainable or natural or these kind of things. It's really look into more specifics. This does require you to spend more time and more energy. And that's the challenge is like, I don't think the onus should only be on consumers, but I think consumers play a role in it. And if you look at the book as a whole, in a way, it's really business that needs to drive this change, right? I mean, that's when you see huge change happening at larger scale because they have that ability to do it. But consumers can certainly play a role in that and help drive that kind of movement.
Next question, and I know that this book just got released, but I'm curious to hear what's next for you. What are you dreaming about, thinking about right now? What's on the horizon?
My dream job would be to continue to tell stories like this. I would love to be able to tell the stories of these kind of individuals on any platform. So that's what I'll keep doing at all times. I don't think that's ever really going to change. I will be sharing this book with many communities over the next 2-3 months. So I will be kind of going to different places and you can follow along. I have a website, eshachhabra.com, or you could follow me on my socials and you can find out where I'm going to be at. But yeah, I'd love to just keep telling these kind of stories. I feel really The greatest thing, the nicest thing that you can hear as a writer covering the space is like, I remember writing about a company when it had just started and it was really in its infancy. And then I hear back from the entrepreneur 5 years later and they're like, hey, we've grown. It was so kind of you that you wrote about it in its early days. And now it's really thriving and it's succeeding and it's doing all the stuff that it had set out to do. So for me, that's very gratifying as a writer to be able to pluck out some of these early innovators and share their stories, because I also know how challenging the media landscape is. It's really hard to get press coverage, especially when you're young. So I'm looking forward to doing that and sharing more of these stories.
Amazing. You do it so well. Before we wrap up, anything else that you want to share with our listeners?
If they read the book, if they can kindly send me a note and share their feedback, I'd love to hear feedback from the community. You can find me on LinkedIn, Instagram, all the platforms, but do tell me what you think of it. I'd love to hear what people are thinking. It's a much more collaborative project, I feel like, than just a typical book that you put out there, and it's just your ideas and your thesis. I mean, this is something that affects all of us. It's going to be something that's going to be important for everyone. So I'd love to hear what you're thinking. Maybe there's tweaks, maybe there's things that I could do better next time.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for having me. So kind of you to think of the book.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
Hi there, it's Phoenix from Lift Economy team. We know that building a positive and effective workplace culture can be tricky, especially when it comes to tackling tough conversations and navigating power dynamics. That's exactly why I've created Culture Offerings, a workshop series designed to give transformational leaders and passionate individuals the tools they need to foster a more collaborative, equitable, and healthy work environment. Our very first workshop, Surfing Workplace Waves, is coming up on June 16th, and we've got plenty of other trainings lined up throughout the year. You can learn more about all of our offerings by checking out lifteconomy.com/culture offerings. Hope to see you there.